There weren't many customers at the pastry booth that morning. It was most likely because it was the start of the work week, and most of the residents of the city were off to work after a pleasant weekend. The vendor watched the passers-by with a bored look, lazily sipping her coffee. At that moment, an elderly woman in her 70s approached the booth and started counting her change. The vendor grimaced but refrained from commenting. Over the years of her work, she had grown accustomed to such situations and preferred not to pay much attention to them. Now she's going to dig through her purse for ages and then claim that she doesn't have enough money. How predictable. Why can't they ever come up with something new? The vendor thought, getting annoyed. At that moment, the old woman approached the booth window and said, "Dear, can I get some bread on credit? I will pay you for it tomorrow." The vendor looked at the elderly customer mockingly and said, "There are so many of you beggars around here. All of you want something from me. And who's going to give me free stuff? You've got some nerve." Tears welled up in the old woman's eyes, and her lips started trembling treacherously. "Do I really look like a beggar? I just need a little piece of bread I haven't eaten in 3 days. And how is that my problem? Stop begging on the streets and find a job like the rest of us," the vendor retorted, sounding annoyed. Frankly speaking, the vendor wasn't open for conversation. At that moment, a tall man appeared behind the old woman. The vendor immediately recognized the wealthy customer and waved at him politely. She knew that the businessman would buy a loaf of white bread and a bag of fresh cinnamon and raisin buns. The vendor looked at the old woman with disdain and said, "Well, how much longer do I have to wait? No money, no bread. You should have figured it out by now, and stop holding up the line." At that moment, the businessman's phone started ringing, and he stepped aside to take the call. This man's name was Chris Brown. He was the owner of a large transportation company that provided shipping services throughout the country. Talking to one of his managers about an order, he couldn't help but glance at the elderly woman standing before him. Her appearance was unremarkable. A plain dress devoid of shape or color, a worn-out bag over her shoulder, and old-fashioned shoes with a small heel. And then Chris's gaze stopped at the brooch pinned to the elderly woman's dress. Chris had definitely seen it before, but he couldn't remember where or when. Especially since the manager's monotonous voice coming from his phone speaker didn't let him focus. Meanwhile, the vendor had shooed the elderly woman away and was watching Chris with a respectful look, waiting for him to finish his phone call. Finally, Chris got off the phone and turned to the vendor with his order, saying, "Good morning, ma'am. I'd like to order a loaf of fresh bread and a bag of cinnamon buns, please." The vendor immediately picked out the most beautiful loaf and handed it to Chris, along with the fragrant pastries. "Thank you, ma'am. Have a good day," the businessman replied, paid for his order, and headed for his car. Instead of going to the office, he decided to return home to bring the fresh pastries to his family, his pregnant wife Nancy, and his twin sons, Kyle and Billy. This had become kind of a tradition for Chris lately, one he faithfully followed, regardless of the day of the week. He pretty much forgot all about the incident with the old woman at the pastry booth, but it did leave some fragmented memories brought about by the antique brooch on the elderly woman's dress. When Chris got back home, his entire family was already awake. The twins, Kyle and Billy, had taken their showers and were sitting in the kitchen, waiting for their portions of fresh bread and peanut butter. Nancy was busy with the coffee maker, intending to treat her husband to a cup of invigorating strong coffee. Soon, the entire family was sitting at the table and discussing the latest news. The thing was that they couldn't do it during dinner, because Chris usually came home very late, when his wife and children were already off to bed. "Darling, I think you should try to work less. You're disappearing at work for days on end, and I can't handle everything on my own," Nancy would say once in a while. Chris knew that Billy was having problems at school and often got into fights, and Kyle was getting poor grades in math, which upset his mother greatly. Having decided to bring this topic up again at breakfast, Chris suggested, "What if we were to hire a tutor to help Kyle with math and to teach Billy proper behavior in school?" Nancy thought about it. Her husband's suggestion sounded reasonable, especially considering that her due date was approaching and she wouldn't have much time to spend with the twins soon. However, Kyle and Billy didn't like their father's idea. They didn't enjoy studying and preferred playing games and watching cartoons. "But where can we find someone who can handle our boys? They're a lot of work, you know that," Nancy said thoughtfully, furrowing her brow. Chris was about to suggest contacting a recruiting agency when he stopped mid-sentence. It suddenly hit him. A teacher? Of course. Why didn't I realize it sooner? That woman at the bakery, her antique brooch. It was Mrs. Somerset, Chris exclaimed, struggling to contain his excitement. Nancy just looked at her husband in surprise. Kyle and Billy got quiet and anxiously watched their father's every move. Chris seemed very agitated and couldn't seem to sit still even for a second. His mind transported him back to the time when he was the same age as Billy and Kyle were now. Back then, he lived with his mother and stepfather, who had a drinking problem and didn't seem too eager to get his act together. Fearing his stepfather's anger, young Chris would often hide in the pantry and stay there until the adults stopped arguing. During that time, he performed very poorly in school, and hardly a day went by without Samantha Brown being called in to see the principal. But what could a woman exhausted by family problems do? Especially when her partner started a fight almost every day. It was during that time that Amanda Somerset came to Chris's rescue. She was teaching math at his school back then. She took the struggling student under her wing and started helping him catch up. She did it on her own initiative and completely free of charge. Amanda had no children, so she cared for Chris as if he were her own son. Over time, thanks to the dedicated teacher's help, Chris became one of the top students in his class. Often, while visiting his favorite teacher, the teenager would notice an antique brooch lying on her bedside table. When he asked about its origin, Mrs. Somerset would reply, "It's my late grandmother's. They say it's been passed down from generation to generation, almost since the time of Franklin, although I believe it's just a family legend with no real historical value." Chris would nod understandingly, never ceasing to admire the beauty of the brooch. And now, he saw it again. Of course, he didn't recognize Mrs. Somerset right away. Too much time had passed since they had last seen each other at his graduation. Life was never kind to the talented teacher, and now even more so as her old age began to take its toll. All of this flashed before Chris's eyes in just a few minutes. When the businessman finally regained his composure, he said, "I think I know a good teacher. Her name is Amanda Somerset." Nancy breathed a sigh of relief, as for a moment there she thought that her husband was getting a migraine. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. Frankly speaking, Chris was feeling guilty that he failed to recognize Mrs. Somerset right away, having mistaken the elderly woman for a beggar. It took Chris about 3 days to track down the teacher from his past. As it turned out, 3 years ago, Mrs. Somerset's house had burnt nearly to the ground due to a lightning strike. Ever since then, the lonely elderly woman had been living on the streets, trying to survive by any means possible. She did have a pension, but its amount was so meager that it barely lasted until the next check arrived. When Mrs. Somerset recognized Chris as her former student, she couldn't hold back her tears. Unfortunately, there was no one to help her. The elderly woman didn't have any relatives. Some of them had passed away, while others lived on the other side of the country, completely unaware of her existence. When Chris offered Mrs. Somerset to move in with his family, she was visibly taken aback. But when she learned that she'd be teaching math to Chris's sons, she couldn't help but smile. Thus, Amanda Somerset had become a member of her former student's family. Despite her advanced age, she managed to make a significant impact on Kyle's level of knowledge. As for Billy, the kind old lady had prepared a special educational program aimed at instilling moral values and proper behavior in the boy. And when Nancy gave birth to the beautiful baby girl, Sarah, the old lady couldn't hold back her tears. About a month later, Billy and Kyle started calling Mrs. Somerset their grandmother, which made both Chris and the old woman very happy. Looking at the happy face of his former teacher, the businessman was confident that he had made the right decision. It's no secret that the boomerang of kindness inevitably returns to the one who launched it, regardless of how much time has passed, be it a year or a couple of decades.